So let's get started. We'll start with this famous so-called confession letter. Oops, why are my slides not sharing? There we go. The famous confession letter to the photography historian and journalist Geoffrey Crawley in 1983, the then 81-year-old Elsie Hill described the cause célèbre which had made her and her cousin famous Frances internationally famous, or at least notorious, as being that same old worn out story. And I think this is really an apt phrasing. Certainly in the 80s and perhaps even more now, the story of the Cottingley Fairies is really ubiquitous. It's really saturated within British popular culture. There we go. And that's only escalating as we approach the centenary of the book that really brought the story to the world, The Coming of the Fairies, published by Arthur Conan Doyle. Cottingley's Fairies continue to inspire all kinds of treatments, films, television parodies, an exhibition at the Brotherton Library last year.
Christine, sorry to interrupt. Can you speak up a little bit?
Oh, yes, sorry. Okay, I will speak up. Hopefully you can hear me, and hopefully you didn't miss some good stuff there. As I was saying, because the story is so well known, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over the details, although I will at the beginning to make sure we're all on the same page. But really, my goal tonight is to consider how the way that we've often retold the stories has worked to perpetuate skewed understandings of the relationship between technology, spirituality, and rationality. And really what I want to do, the project I'm leading along with colleagues in the Science Museum and at Senate House Library, is to rethink some of those relationships. Mostly I want to emphasise why science history collections like the Cottingley Fairy material at NSMM are such important and underused resources for the history of psychical research and for paranormal belief. So that same old worn out story, what is it? Well, let us return to the summer of 1917 in the Yorkshire village of Cottingley, where the Wright family, Father Albert, Mother Polly, and daughter Elsie, are hosting Polly's sister Annie and her 8-year-old daughter Frances, both recently returned from Cape Town. Scolded for getting her shoes wet while playing outside, Frances claimed that she'd seen fairies and not for the first time. Jumping loyally to her defence, her cousin Elsie said that she had seen them too, and if they were lent the photo at the family Midge camera, they would provide proof. Humouring them, Elsie's father Albert sent them out with the device and just a single photographic plate on which they produced the basis for the first image, which is known as photo A, although we now think that this much circulated image was substantially retouched from an earlier prototype. You can see both of those here. Now this, despite an underwhelming response from their skeptical parents, the girls tried again a few months later, producing photo B. Now, this would have been the end of the story had not Elsie's mother, Polly, went to a talk on fairy belief at the Bradford Theosophical Society a few years later, where she mentioned the pictures to one of the speakers. From there, the story made its way to the London theosophist, Edward Gardner, who immediately obtained the negatives and the copyright for the negatives and began lecturing on them as objective proof of the existence of the nature entities whose existence had long been asserted by theosophy. And theosophy is essentially, it's a new religious movement founded in New York about 5 decades before this in the 1870s. The cause was taken up by foremost British literary celebrity and spiritualist proponent Arthur Conan Doyle, who with Gardner gifted the girls the subsequent 2 Cameo Cameras and 72 plates in the hope that they could produce further, even more compelling evidence of fairy phenomena. So it's then, this is in 1920 then, 3 years after the initial pictures, that the girls take the second cycle of photos C, D, and E. Doyle would then write 2 sensational articles defending the authenticity of the pictures in the Strand magazine, in which he had first made his name as a creator of the Sherlock Holmes stories, or is most associated with the Sherlock Holmes stories. These articles are Fairies, you can see them on the slide here. Fairies photographed, an epoch-making event, which is a hell of a subtitle, and the evidence for Fairies. So they came out in December 1920 and March 1921, respectively. Then Doyle expands them into the longer book lengths, The Coming of the Fairies, which hit and sold out in British bookstores in September 1922, and argued that if we recognised the existence of fairy life, this would, quote, jolt the material 20th century mind out of its heavy ruts in the mud, and will make it admit that there is a glamour and a mystery to life. Now, as I said, this book sold really well, but we shouldn't mistake popularity and sales with any kind of widespread assent to its central proposition. Although some readers are cautious or neutral, others really mock and jeer at Doyle and Gardner for failing to recognise the fairies as the drawn and staged cutout figures that Frances and Elsie would over 60 years admit them to be, or rather that they would admit almost all, not all, but almost all of the photos to be. It's worth pointing out that neither of the girls had wanted things to go so far, nor for the photos to have any audience beyond their immediate family and friends. Let's not forget the case had, and its aftermath had profound harm, caused profound harm for the two. They were hounded by the press after being what we would now call doxed by the Westminster Gazette in 1921. The paper published their names and addresses, which seems, you know, an unthinkable lapse of journalistic ethics for underage girls in 1921. After that, Frances is bullied at school and Elsie fired from her job at Sharp's Christmas card factory. Both eventually had to leave the area, with Elsie moving all the way to America. I had no idea, remarks Frances in her poignant, posthumously published memoir, Reflections on the Cottingley Fairy, that came out in 2009, that anybody would think photos of any importance. Nor could she understand why, quote, plain, ordinary people would think them real. This, of course, is not the first time in the history of the paranormal that 2 young girls had found themselves in a situation that spiraled rapidly out of their control. Witness Kate and Maggie Fox, the American sisters credited with founding the modern spiritualist movement, from which they unsuccessfully tried to extricate themselves after a lifetime of career of high-profile celebrity mediumship had ruined their health and their finances. So there is some precedent for this situation. You don't really want to be a child associated with a new religious movement or a high-profile religious movement. Often has negative consequences for you. Okay. In the aftermath of Elsie's 1980s confession, maybe explanation is a better term, Doyle's uneven reputation as a rationalist, one attained both through his medical training and his creation of Holmes, came under further attack, continuing the downward trajectory initiated by his public announcement of spiritualist belief in 1916, in November of 1916. Now, it's important to point out here that Doyle came out as a spiritualist in 1916, but of course he wasn't a recent believer, a recent convert. We know that he'd been going to seances regularly since the late 1880s and been a member of the Society for Psychical Research since 1893. More, his declaration well predates the 1918 and 1919 losses of his son Kingsley and brother Innes that some historians have, even otherwise perceptive ones like Crawley, have mistakenly believed to have driven his conversion. But I think there's a reason why this story of Doyle as being a recently bereaved and then mentally disordered trauma victim has become popular or remained popular. It fits a particularly resilient and flawed characterization of this case as a kind of triumph for rationalism, right? An episode that demonstrates the slippery slope into which one embarks by flirting with a belief in, for example, the existence of spirits. And I'll give you some examples of this kind of positioning. Here's Geoffrey Crawley saying, the Cottingley Fair undoubtedly marks the transition of Doyle from his great self to the irrationality which took him over more and more from then on. Which seems, I don't know, we'll see what you think of that. It seems a bit harsh. With slightly more nuance, the historian Alex Owen presents Doyle's irrationality less as an actual fact than as a common public perception in the aftermath of the case. His championing of the Cottingley Fairies served to further marginalise him in the eyes of a titillated but disbelieving public. Poor Sherlock Holmes, hopelessly crazy. So appealing has it proved to imagine the Cottingley case as representing or causing for Doyle a sudden kind of breakdown or loss of sense that many journalists since have had to keep resurrecting Doyle's sanity or rationality in order to dramatically strip it away. I'll give you an example of this. Here's an article from 1983 in the Times, published in the wake of Elsie's revelations, which declares the reputations of the world's most famous fairies and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, are in tatters. And I can only think that Doyle would have been very amused at this from 83, rumours of his reputational death having already been long-standing and, let's be honest, somewhat exaggerated. So what does this framing of Gardner and Doyle as these kind of bereaved, gullible dupes do? Well, it leaves only really one position for Francis and Elsie, as sly, crafty, and deliberate tricksters, exploiting, maybe admirably, their constant underestimation as naive, untaught village girls, too unskilled or too innocent to pull off a feat of this magnitude. Indeed, this is an interpretation that Doyle himself maybe inadvertently seeded in the introduction to The Coming of the Fairies, when he declared, the series of incidents set forth in this little volume represent either the most elaborate and ingenious hoax ever played upon the public, or else they constitute an event in human history which may in future appear to have been epoch-making in its character. One or the other, right? The greatest hoax ever or an epoch-making event, right? We see this rhetoric in other places as well. James Randi, aka the Amazing Randi, the first of the Cottingley investigators to detect, using enhanced photography, the mechanism by which the cutouts were suspended and the print source for them, wrote in his 1995 book, Supernatural A to Z, only a few years ago, the two who had perpetrated this rather delicious hoax on Conan Doyle and through him the world died, right? So again, the girls are seen as deliberate perpetrators of hoax. Even the interpretive text that accompanies the Cottingley camera exhibition at the National Science and Media Museum, I don't know if some of you in the audience might have seen it, also uses this language of hoax, referring to it, you can see on the slide here, as the greatest photographic hoax. So I think what I want to say is the problem with this presentation of the girls as hoaxers and the men as sort of irrationalists is that it stands very much in the way of what we know to be the facts of the case, suggesting an agency that was routinely denied to Elsie and Francis in the reception and the making of the photographs. And also in the language of Doyle's study. More, claims of elaborate strategy suggest a knowledge of the girls' intentions and practice that Doyle and Gardner never had, and more importantly, and this is what I really want to stress, that they never sought. Doyle made no attempt to meet Francis and Elsie, and Gardner did so, and only belatedly. He'd been lecturing on these slides for months, right, before he ever came to Cottingley. In fact, what really for me distinguishes this case is its marked and significant form of, I'm going to call it investigative reticence or reluctance. Not reluctance to investigate the improved negative of, or the negatives of these images, but rather to investigate the girls themselves as camera operators. Now, there's a number of conclusions that we can draw about this, the distance that Doyle stubbornly maintained between himself and the girls. We could take him at his own word that he was too busy to come up to Cottingley at that time. We know he was just about to embark on a major spiritualist tour of New Zealand and Australia. That might be the best case. The worst case we can see his distance as a reflection of a kind of sexist and classist conviction that anything the girls might have to say about how they made these photographs is simply far less important than his own interpretation as a cosmopolitan elite. You know, Frances was really annoyed. She was never asked by the men about how she took these photos or how she was involved in these photos. And I think there's truth in both of those things. But in this next part of my talk, I want to suggest another reason. And this is one that's rooted not in sort of maybe the hidden motives of Doyle or his own personal beliefs, but rather in a growing crisis within the technological spirituality that had come to dominate spiritualist and theosophical circles at the beginning of the 20th century. Although not sacred in themselves, new technologies, spiritualists often then asserted, could, if handled correctly, become enchanted and given transcendent purpose. They could reveal the unseen if they were handled by the right mediumistically gifted operator. But so too, and frankly, too often, did this necessary human agent become a liability, right? A source of trickery or deception that would compromise the very claims that their technological productions were meant to evidence. In order to extract spiritual value from new forms of technology, spiritualists like Doyle might have felt compelled, or I would suggest for Doyle absolutely did feel compelled, to purge or cleanse it from the taint of human handling. And the coming of the fairies, I think, represents an attempt to do exactly this. And I think we can see this attempt to, I'm going to use making up this verb, am I, to unhandle Cottingley. In some ways, we can really see this technique clearly when we consider it in relationship to the other work of, I guess, the other spiritualist technological testimonial that Doyle publishes in the same year. And that's this book that you can see here, The Case for Spirit Photography. I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. Other people have pointed out Cottingley wasn't Doyle's first turn at the rodeo, as it were, in terms of writing about paranormal photography, nor really his first time writing about photography. We know that he was a really keen photographer. He published 13 articles in the British Journal of Photography in the early 1880s. He really knows a lot more about photography than he lets on in the Coming of the Fairies. But he absolutely drew on that experience in this book, The Case for Spirit Photography. And this is based primarily on his relationships with the crew-based medium William Hope. My colleague Ephraim Sarah Schreier, who I think might be here tonight, is going to be talking about Hope in January. So if you're interested in him, come and see that talk then. Now this book, he's working on this book, he's investigating it, the evidence at the same time he's involved in Cottingley, right? So this book comes out in December 1922, The Coming of the Fairies comes out in September. So they're only 3 months apart, but they really, really come from different worlds. And by different worlds, I mean different investigative worlds and evidentiary worlds. They take completely different attitudes and approaches to this question of how do you authenticate a paranormal photograph? For Hope, when Doyle wants to investigate, he literally puts himself in the picture. In the case for Spirit of Photography, he describes going to Crewe to meet Hope in the summer of 1919 and bringing his own photographic plates with him to make sure that there was no interference. He then describes in detail how he goes with Hope, the medium, into the darkroom. He opens up the plate, puts the plates in the carrier, marks them with his own hand, and then carries the carrier into the room where the camera is and the pictures are taken. And then Doyle develops the photographs himself. So he's absolutely hands-on in this. When the first set of photographs aren't very effective, they try again. This time Doyle lets Hope use his own photographic plates, but he insists that he takes precautions that it would only weary the reader if I gave every point of detail. So we kind of have to take him on his word in this. But he insists on his own presence for the investigation. The second time it's more successful. He gets a spirit extra on the photograph they take that shows the likeness of a young man that is, it's not a particularly good likeness, but somewhat resembles his son Kingsley as he was some 8 years before his death. So think about what Doyle is doing here. In this account, he's examining the camera, he's examining the plates, but most of all, he's examining the character of William Hope as a medium, right? With a kind of taking a kind of like forensic approach to describing his appearance and character, the means by which he confirms that Hope is a trustworthy person. Much is made of Hope's 17-year experience of taking spirit photographs, an emphasis that establishes skill, craft, and practice as key factors in trustworthiness. So too does he read Hope's face and hands. Here's what he has to say about him. In person, Hope is a man who gives the impression of being between 50 and 60 years of age, with the manner and appearance of an intelligent working man. His forehead is high and indicates a good, if untrained, brain beneath. The general effect of his face is aquiline, with large, well-opened, honest blue eyes and moustache, which is shading from yellow to grey. His hands, with their worn nails and square-ended fingers, are those of the worker, and the least adapted to sleight of hand tricks of any I have seen. It's exactly this handiness, this emphasis on handiwork and on human hands that I'm going to suggest he wants to leave out of Cottingley. Okay, so The Coming of the Fairies, again, published just a few months prior to this, works by a completely opposite logic, staying well and deliberately away from the handiwork of Elsie and Francis. If we today want to understand the operations of either the Midge camera that took the first images, or the Cameo camera that took the last three, we have to resort to contemporary technical manuals. Now, both cameras, or all the cameras, were of the popular handheld box style, which had been introduced to the market some 30 years earlier, equipped with a built-in shutter and an automatic magazine, which, as Crawley describes, enabled the photographers to take a series of exposures. I won't read all of that quote, I'll leave it there, but essentially, rather than having to sort of do one image at a time, you put one plate in, you expose it, then you take it out and develop, you have an automatic mechanism that keeps pushing new plates forward. So you can automatize that process. This design is a world away from what Doyle described as Hope's old-fashioned instrument, to which he still clings, and which, with its battered box and broken leg, is familiar to many of us. So I suppose what's important about the new box camera for our purposes is, on one sense, sure, I mean, I guess like your iPhone, like it's quite sealed, there's fewer access points for manipulative intervention and hacking between each exposure, but far more opportunity to produce deliberate or unintentional double exposure. Indeed, this capacity of the box camera is so well known at the start of the 20th century that it becomes a kind of unique selling point. Let me give you an example. This is from I'm not sure, that text is probably too small for you to read, but if you can see the craven there, I'll read the text for this is a camera that is marketed specifically so that you can take double exposure fake photographs. The text says, the particular advantage of the #2 craven camera is that it is fitted with a patent duplicator behind the lens, by means of which the two halves of the plate may be exposed separately. This is useful for many things, but especially for taking trick photographs, such as a person wheeling himself in a wheelbarrow, or a man's body on someone else's legs, or any one object in two different positions in the same plate. And those all sound like great ideas, right? Not sure why the wheelbarrow example is the one they chose, but yeah, this is being sold to you so you can take photos that deceive and amuse. This practice of double exposure was initially supposed to have been responsible for some, or at least one, of the Cottingley photographs. And while we now know that it didn't feature in all of them, what this shows us is that the technique is certainly far better known and more common in this period than Doyle admits in his study of the case. Now, another thing to notice about this advertisement here is not only the function of the cameras they describe, but also the cost. All of these models in 1905 are purchasable for the price of a guinea, right? They're guinea cameras, and this is at the lower end of the market for this range. And according to the National Archives Historical Currency Converter, this is equivalent roughly to about 82.50 in today's money, or about 3 days salary for a skilled tradesman. Now, this isn't, it's not cheap by any means, but certainly affordable for middle and upper working class families like the Wrights, whose midge in any case we think was it was a gift from a family member. It seems to have been free. The first camera that was used in the photographs, is a lot cheaper than the gift cameras that the girls received from Gardner and Doyle, which Frances remembered as being much more sophisticated. And she says, had, we were told, a special lens which cost £20. Now think for a minute how terrifying that must have been for these young girls to have been told the value of these cameras with which they are then expected to produce results. £20 in 1920 is roughly equivalent to £581, or 2 months' wages for a skilled tradesman. Now, I haven't been able to independently confirm that the lenses in these cameras actually did cost what Frances was told they would cost. But even just being told that, I think, would have a kind of sobering effect, or yes, a perhaps terrifying effect on the girls. Anyway, given this cost, it seems all the more remarkable that Doyle and Gardner didn't come to observe their investment in action. Gardner's explanation that in-person observation might, put off the fairies, strikes hollow in light of the precedents for testing spirit photography. Doyle's absence seems all the more perplexing. If you really think something is going to be an epoch-making event, and you're willing to throw your entire reputation behind it, why wouldn't you want to go in person? Indeed, it becomes increasingly clear across the coming of the fairies that Doyle and Gardner alike wished to detach Elsie and Frances from the technical making of the photos as far as possible, and to let the negatives and images speak in their place. Now, this happens in various ways. We can see it, for example, in the way that the girls' ages are sort of always downplayed. Their abilities, their experiences are also downplayed. We know that Elsie has a lot of experience working in various artistic jobs, but this, again, is not made much of. It's kept quiet in the coming of the fairies. We can also see it simply in the use of the passive voice throughout the book. I mean, think about, and in the first article, fairies photographed. Well, that doesn't tell you who's done the photographing, does it? Just presents them as if they took photos themselves. And then the coming of the fairies, not fairies are here, you know, fairies arrive. There's a lot of sort of, I would say, suppressed agency in this kind of work. Okay, now I'm going to speed up just a little bit, or rather move on just a little bit, so we can get into our discussion. There are other examples, and maybe we can talk about them later, where in The Coming of the Fairies, both Doyle and Gardner, who really write this work together, although Doyle is the only one who's credited as author, kind of try and detract attention from Elsie and Frances, invite us to pay no attention to the girls behind the curtain. To recognize that they do this might be to suggest that they're not the dupes of the piece, but maybe the villains of the case. I don't think this is entirely fair either. Rather, I think it comes, as I was saying earlier, this impulse represents a particular, perhaps inevitable destination of the technological ambitions that the occult revival had been pursuing past several decades, right? As our project is showing, alternative religious believers in this time were really embracing all forms of technology to try and fulfill the demands for evidence then expected from a fairly modern and up-to-date spirituality, right? So this would mean using cameras, typewriters, telegrams, tape recordings, magnets, you name it, that seem to be pure instruments whose recording capacities are neutral. But of course, this is always a fraught project, because as the personality of the operator can always come under suspicion. Technological media are tricky, apt to introduce doubt as they are proof. Even in its very earliest days, as Daniel Novak and others have pointed out, photography was widely understood to be subjective, complex, and highly manipulable, not a foolproof guarantor of the real. As such, some early theosophists, Some early theosophists, yes, in the late 19th century had started to reject photography in favor of another form of spiritualized artistic mode. And that is these kind of portraits referred to as Acheiropoietic portraits. I'll tell you briefly what these means. These are portraits here of the two spiritual masters, or Mahatmas as they were known, in the 1880s, Kuthumi and Master Morya. They're really important in theosophy. They are alleged immortals living somewhere in the interior of Tibet who were communicating with mediums or spiritual figures to try and direct the spiritual evolution of humanity. Now, what's interesting about these portraits and other masters' portraits produced in this period is that they were supernatural not only in who they show, but also in their mode of production. And the mode of production for many of these is acheiropoietic. So what does acheiropoietic mean? Simply, this term means art that is not produced by human hands. Art that might be produced by a medium who is under the control of an intermediating spirit, or an entity of some kind, or sometimes art that is produced automatically, literally with no human hands involved. Thinking, for example, of the Scottish medium David Duckett, who was known in the 1870s for walking into a seance room, a blank canvas would be in front of him, the light would be turned out, it would be turned on, and there would be a fresh oil painting in front of him. Simply not enough time for a human hand to have produced this. Acheiropoietic paintings aren't unique to this late Victorian occult milieu. They have a long history, and we can find them in the Orthodox Church in that tradition, and we can find descriptions of them in ancient Roman texts. I've got a good example here from the Roman erotic novel Leucippe and Clitophon, which describes our Clitophon, our hero, walking into a cave and seeing this beautiful portrait of Andromeda and Prometheus in a cleft in the wall, and it's so perfectly situated there that he thinks it can only have been produced by natural causes. And he seems to hear a voice saying, "No human hand made me. This painting is a spontaneous creation of nature." I think it's a really fascinating phrase for what I'm trying to capture about Cottingley. No human hand made me. This painting is a spontaneous creation of nature. This sentiment, I think, goes a long way to explaining Doyle's desires for the Cottingley pictures, ones whose production processes he sought to imbue with the same unconstrained impulsive wildness as their seemingly elemental subjects, these fairies. In Elsie and Frances, Doyle found perfect mediums not for scientific testing, but for this fantasy of acheiropoiesis, for art that is produced without a need of a human hand. Young girls are seemingly unpleasingly lacking in experience, as old hands like William Hope were full of it. To meet, observe, and test the technical processes of subjects like these would really be beside the point. They could and must in some ways have nothing to say about the images whose production they attended, but are not supposed to be responsible for. The automized nature of the box camera serves as an ideal analogy for the kind of qualities that many Cottingley supporters wanted to find in these pictures, that they are sudden, unplanned, dynamic, fleeting, untaught, and so forth. Pictures so natural that they seem almost to have taken themselves without the need for any human intervention. So I think I will stop there. Thanks very much, everyone. Hope that wasn't too quiet. But yeah, let's see how we go from there.